Typhoon Haikui helped create history when it blew through this massive wind turbine off the coast of Fujian, China this September. In just one day, the turbine created enough power for 170,000 homes. This is the crux of the story of China's energy transition this decade that sees record after record being broken. Almost half the world's operating wind power capacity is in China. It even has more solar capacity than the US, EU, and actually the rest of the world combined.
China's building renewable capacity at a scale that's literally off the charts.
And yet, China has a terrible reputation.
China's carbon emissions are nearly twice what the US has.
So, is China a climate hero or a climate villain? Or is there more to the story? There are two main commitments that China has made. One is to hit a peak in carbon dioxide emissions before 2030, which means that they need to lower carbon emissions after, and to be carbon neutral by 2060, where they balance emissions out by absorbing the same amount of carbon from the atmosphere as they emit, like with trees or technology.
Its carbon peak by 2030, I think this could actually be moved ahead. It already looks like it very much achieves what it set out for carbon peak much earlier.
Many other analysts believe this too.
China is also leading the world when you look at the consumption of coal. So half of the consumption of coal of the entire world is consumed in China.
This is the big contradiction. Over 80% of China's primary energy comes from coal, oil, or gas, which makes it the world's biggest emitter of greenhouse gases. Post-pandemic, China announced a phase down in fossil fuels, but it didn't last long. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, China began ramping up its fossil fuel investments. It is now building 6 times as many coal-fired power plants as the rest of the world combined. That's 2 new coal plants every week. Beijing says its developing population needs energy security.
China has repeatedly had energy blackouts. So in 21 and 22, certain regions had suddenly no electricity. And I mean, if it's in the winter and it's cold and hospitals or family with elderly people don't have a warm heating system, that's quite dramatic.
Heat waves across the country drove up demand for energy in these years. Think air conditioning. The Guangdong province, for example, required almost 5% more energy in 2022 than the previous year. And its capital had a blackout.
From China's point of view, this energy security is very much linked to its staying in power, because if people are not doing well, that could be a political risk.
The new plants do not necessarily mean that coal-related emissions will go up significantly, but they do extend China's reliance on coal. And the more coal we have in the system, the higher the impact on global warming. Coal makes sense for China right now because of its abundant supplies. It's got the 4th largest reserves in the world, and the country has a long history and knowledge of how to tap into it, cheaply and at scale.
Replacing coal is not easy, particularly when you don't have a viable alternative for high quality heat. You need to combust something typically to use it for industrial processes like steel and cement manufacturing. China has a huge industrial footprint, meaning that you need a high baseload power capacity at all times. And it's not impossible, but it's very difficult to achieve that in a very large electricity system purely with renewables.
One reason China is not using its vast resources of renewables yet is because they are not well integrated into the grid. Another reason is that its battery storage isn't at the point where solar can be preserved on dark days or wind can be preserved on non-windy ones at scale. Analysts say the cleaner way for China to move forward would be to focus on improving the technological infrastructure of the grid to make it more sustainable and efficient, not build new, dirty generators. But China says it cannot afford to take the political risk of blackouts, nor the economic one for now.
It is extremely politically sensitive, particularly when it comes to employment and tax revenue. But it's also the case that jobs in the coal mining industry in particular are already being lost at a very rapid rate.
Coal is embedded into the system. But as we saw before, investments into renewables are still huge. The country attracted more than $500 billion in investments in 2022 into solar, wind energy, electric vehicles, and batteries. That's nearly 4 times the amount that the US did.
Wind, solar, energy storage, electric vehicles, these are really kind of the emerging stars in our domestic economy. And I think increasingly policymakers realize the important contributions that they can provide. to not just our decarbonization agenda, but economic growth.
It's forging ahead in many ways.
This includes very heavy favorable state policies. It includes, China's ability to build the supply chains of those key technologies in a very short period of time.
The country also issues approvals for renewable energy very quickly, as opposed to, say, the US, where one county met for 19 nights to debate a single wind farm. This is paying off for China, which now dominates the solar manufacturing sector worldwide and produces as much as 80% of all solar panels. And it is paying off for the rest of the world. Cheap solar PV cells have significantly pulled down the cost of solar energy globally, making it the cheapest renewable energy in many countries. India and Pakistan, for example, have been able to significantly decarbonize their own economies. But all of this does come at a significant cost.
The domestic cost of that in terms of, polluted water, air, the human cost has been enormous.
The Three Gorges Dam, for example, was an environmental disaster. And the impacts of lithium mining for batteries are huge parts of the flip side of China's climate trajectory that cannot be ignored.
Within the climate justice movement, I kind of find myself saying sometimes, well, if you want a world that's going to consume this amount of energy per year, it's going to come at an environmental cost. And the question is, what is the acceptable level of environmental cost?
Though there's one other sticking point that China puts forward. While it is true that China is the world's top polluter, counting the emissions over time tells a different story. The US has been the biggest historical emitter. That means that the US is responsible for 17% of emissions that have contributed to the climate crisis since 1850, and China is at 12%. Leaders of both countries met earlier this month and agreed to do more. They even pledged to triple renewable energy capacity globally by 2030. And everybody is watching out for the moves of these two big players at the climate conference taking place in Dubai. Because what both countries do really matters.
China is now very clearly in the driving seat of the world's climate outcomes. And unless China decarbonizes, we might as well just give up and go home. So all of what I've said may be true, but it's also important to be smart in keeping the pressure up on China to decarbonize.
China must cut its reliance on coal, but it is hard to ignore the fact that without China's bold renewable strategy, the world would probably have no hope of cutting greenhouse gas emissions fast enough to avoid a catastrophic global warming scenario without it.
Carbon dioxide emissions from burning fossil fuels are set to hit a record high this year. That's according to a new report released today. The Global Carbon Budget report says emissions from coal, oil and gas are still rising, driven largely by India and China, the world's biggest emitters. But historically, China has still contributed less than the United States to climate change, and it's investing heavily in renewable energy.
A grey blanket of smog. Here in China's capital, Beijing, not a rare occurrence. While air quality has improved, it's still a big problem. A major cause is burning coal.
We're still, unfortunately, heavily addicted to fossil fuel. We actually burn more than half of the global coal consumption every year.
China is the world's biggest polluter, responsible for almost a third of all carbon dioxide emissions. And it's continuing to ramp up its use of fossil fuels. In 2022, the nation permitted 6 times more coal projects than the rest of the world combined, according to one report. One reason is climate change. The country is being heavily impacted by global warming, and related heat waves are leading to more demand for air conditioning. Another reason is industry. China is a global leader in both steel and cement production, sectors with high energy needs.
Replacing coal is not easy, particularly when you don't have a viable alternative for high quality heat. It's not impossible, but it's very difficult to achieve that in a very large electricity system purely with renewables.
But China is leading in clean energy too. China's investment in renewable energy in 2022 dwarfed other nations at more than $270 billion, compared with other big investors like the European Union with $55.9 billion and the United States with $49.5 billion. China produces 80% of all solar panels and is also a huge manufacturer of wind turbines, electric vehicles and batteries, driving its own move towards clean energy and making it cheaper for other countries to also move forward.
Those sectors are primarily boosted over the last decade or so by China's strong industrial policies. It includes, China's ability to build the supply chains of those key technologies in a very short period of time. It also has a lot to do with just the sheer size of our domestic market.
China is set to hit its highest CO2 emission levels by 2025 at the latest, after which its emissions will start to drop, helped by huge investments in renewable energy. But unless it abandons its coal addiction, scenes like these are unlikely to disappear anytime soon.
Journalist Fabian Kretschmer joins us from Beijing. Fabian, as mentioned before, just in 2022, China invested more than $270 billion in clean energy. But is that enough?
Well, it's really difficult to assess China's performance because it's sending so mixed signals. So if you look at China's investment into renewables, then it's really impressive. And on a global scale, it's unprecedented. I give you just two examples. The predictions for this year, 2023, are that China will invest in total 70% more in renewables than the European Union and the US combined. And also electric mobility, China is leading by far. By 2025, more than half of the newly sold vehicles will be electric. But if you ask me, is it enough? I think it's only enough if China will manage to decrease its high energy demand, and that is not happening yet. So I would say, even despite the really impressive investment into renewables, we are not where we should be at this point.
How can we understand the contradiction that China, while investing heavily in renewable energy, is also building a record number of new coal power plants?
Yeah, that's a big contradiction. And if you ask the government here, why are you, building so many new coal power plants? I mean, that is against the goals that Xi Jinping also gave. I mean, basically, it's against the green transformation. And the government will always say, yes, those coal power plants, we will not run them at high capacity. They are more a backup plan in case there's not enough water for our hydropower, or if there's a long-lasting drought in summer, etc. And I mean, there's something to it, but basically you have new infrastructure, new coal power plants, and it's very unlikely that they will be retired in 10 or 15 years. So that's really a wrong signal. I think the core of the problem is that China's economic model is highly energy intensive. It relies on real estate. It relies on huge infrastructure projects, on industry, manufacturing, etc. So that requires a lot of energy. And so far, I think the government thinks it can combine both. It can keep its economic model, at the same time empower it with renewable energies. And from my opinion, I think this will be almost impossible to achieve.
All of that said, global carbon emissions from fossil fuels are set to hit a record high. We just got a new report today, and China had a lot to do with it, didn't it?
Yes, so according to the new report, China is mostly responsible, China and India, to be fair, for the increase in global fossil emissions. So why is that? One reason is also a one-time reason. China basically 1 year ago lifted all the zero COVID restrictions and had a pandemic rebound, which was rather delayed. So now we saw a lot of construction and a lot of production of steel, cement, etc. Because after 3 years of pandemic closure, now there was a rebound. So, but still, it's definitely alarming that China is responsible for the increase of fossil fuels, and we should keep an eye on that.
That was Fabian Kretschmer. Thank you so much.